In 1947, Los Angeles wore two faces. One looked up toward the glittering Hollywood hills, the bright marquees of movie houses, and dreams that tasted like champagne. But the other looked down into the gutters, into the lives of those struggling desperately to rise from the cracks in the pavement. Veterans returned to find their wives more independent. Women had held factory jobs, driven ambulances, raised families alone. Now, told to return to the kitchens and typing pools, some did. Others didn't. Los Angeles became a place to start fresh, to disappear, to dream big or to vanish entirely. The movies were the city's crown jewel. But behind the velvet curtain, exploitation, failed auditions, casting couches. Men with power. Girls with nowhere else to go. It was in this world that a young woman named Elizabeth Short arrived from Medford, Massachusetts. Hollywood was built on the dreams of many, but for most, it was a place that chewed them up and spit them out, leaving nothing but forgotten names, never to be remembered. Elizabeth was just another girl who got lost in the shadows. 1947 was a bloody year. The LAPD was stretched thin. Gangs roamed Boyle Heights and Echo Park. Prostitution rings operated under the cover of nightclubs. Murders often went unsolved not for lack of effort, but for lack of resources. Elizabeth Short's case would soon explode into the biggest crime story in Los Angeles history. But in those early days, she was just another lost girl in the crowd. No one knew her name on January 14th. But within 48 hours, everyone in the country would. Before she became the Black Dahlia, she was simply Beth. Or Bet. Or just Elizabeth. She was someone's daughter. Someone's friend. A woman whose smile hid a world of secrets and quiet dreams, dreams that were slowly slipping through her fingers. Elizabeth Short was born in 1924 in Hyde Park, a quiet suburb of Boston, where she lived her early years surrounded by uncertainty. Her father disappeared when she was still young, leaving her mother, Phoebe, to raise 5 daughters alone during the harsh Great Depression. She was delicate, often sick with bronchitis and asthma, forced to spend cold winters in Florida. It was there she discovered a love for palm trees, sunlight, and the fantasies of a different life, one beyond the snow-covered sidewalks of Medford. But hardship marked her early years. Beneath her smile, a young woman longed for something more, something that would lift her far beyond this small, lonely town. In her teens and early 20s, Elizabeth drifted from city to city, working odd jobs as a waitress or a clerk. She dated soldiers, wrote hopeful letters, and clung to the idea of love. But the dream of Hollywood still called her name. Elizabeth wasn't a criminal yet. One of her most infamous photographs was taken after she was arrested for underage drinking. A dark-haired girl, wide-eyed, caught in a flash of police lights. That mugshot would become an image synonymous with her downfall, but it wasn't a reflection of her true self. She was just young. Lost. Searching. Elizabeth's life was a patchwork of stories, each one designed to make her seem more than she was. She claimed to have been engaged to an Air Force pilot who died in a crash. She told people she was an aspiring actress, or the daughter of a wealthy businessman. Were they lies? Fantasies? Or perhaps, just a way to survive? Perhaps Elizabeth wasn't lying to others. Perhaps she was trying to build a version of herself that could survive in the chaotic world of Los Angeles. She told herself that she would become someone. A star. And in Hollywood, everyone wore a mask. Elizabeth was no different. She was a mystery to those who crossed her path. Some described her as quiet and graceful, while others said she was flirtatious, unreliable. But everyone agreed on one thing: she was beautiful. Her carefully tailored black dresses, red lipstick, and elegance never failed to turn heads. Elizabeth moved from home to home, from friend to stranger. Always bouncing from place to place, she never found a true home. She was often broke. But she never stopped chasing a dream. A dream that could turn into a nightmare. In the weeks leading up to her tragic death, Elizabeth was staying at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. On January 9, 1947, she left the hotel lobby. That was one of the last confirmed sightings of her alive. January 15, 1947. The city was still waking up. It was early, still too early for any of this to make sense. At first, it looked like a mannequin. A pale, broken thing lying in the weeds. It wasn't. Betty Berzinger, a housewife, was walking her 3-year-old daughter that morning when she noticed something strange near a sidewalk curb. As she approached, she realized it wasn't a mannequin at all. It was the naked, mutilated body of a woman, posed with surgical precision. The body had been washed clean. No blood. No prints. No signs of life or struggle. Whoever did this, they knew exactly what they were doing. They had control. Or worse, an intimacy. The LAPD was called immediately. Officers Frank Perkins and Will Fitzgerald were the first on the scene. They'd never seen anything like it. The body had been washed clean. No blood. No prints. No signs of life or struggle. Whoever did this, they knew exactly what they were doing. They had control. Or worse, an intimacy. A few hours later, a fingerprint technician ran her prints through FBI records. Elizabeth Short had once worked at an army base. Her prints were on file. Just like that, the Jane Doe had a name. Elizabeth Short. And within hours, she had a new name, the Black Dahlia. The name was a mark of shame, a branding that would last for decades. They painted her as a temptress, a drifter, a woman with a secret life. But who was she really? Was this the story she would have chosen? The case was now public. Pressure mounted on the LAPD with every passing hour. They weren't just chasing a killer, they were racing against time. Against public hysteria. And against the relentless media that fed on every twisted detail. Chief of Detectives Thad Brown was determined to bring the case to a close. He created a special task force to hunt down the killer. More than 60 officers were assigned full-time to the investigation. They re-interviewed everyone who had known Elizabeth Short. They traced her last movements. They followed every thread, no matter how small. They had leads. So many leads. Everyone seemed to know something. A waitress. A hotel clerk. Taxi drivers. Former lovers. Yet, with each interview, they were only left with more questions. It was like Elizabeth Short had vanished, and left nothing but ghosts behind. Soon, the madness began. Within weeks, dozens of people claimed to know who killed Elizabeth Short. Some were attention seekers. Others, disturbed. Some even showed up with blood-stained clothing, ready to confess. The tabloids were more than happy to fill in the blanks, adding their own theories, their own version of events. The Black Dahlia's secret life, they screamed. Was she a seductress? But none of them bothered to ask who was Elizabeth Short really. Just as the investigation was losing steam, a mysterious letter arrived. The Los Angeles Examiner received an envelope containing Elizabeth Short's social security card, her birth certificate, a folder of photographs, and a note: Here is Dahlia's belongings letter to follow. It was signed, the Black Dahlia Avenger. This wasn't just a letter. It was a warning. The fingerprints on the envelope had been smudged with gasoline, deliberately wiped clean. The sender was careful. They knew how to cover their tracks. But they had left a trail. And the LAPD followed it, hoping it would lead them to the killer. The task force began to narrow down their search. They focused on the medical community, surgeons, morticians, anyone who might have the knowledge to carry out such a precise and grisly crime. Theories swirled. Some believed Elizabeth was stalked. Others thought it was a crime of opportunity. And still, others speculated that Elizabeth may have known her killer and trusted him. One controversial theory emerged: what if the murder wasn't committed by a single person? What if there were multiple killers involved? Some speculated that Elizabeth was taken to one location, tortured, and then moved elsewhere. The killer's method suggested control, obsession. And the way Elizabeth's body was posed was no accident. It wasn't just a murder. It was a message. As the days turned into weeks, the case grew colder. But not for lack of suspects. In fact, there were too many. Over 150 individuals were questioned. Some were named publicly. Others were quietly eliminated behind the scenes. But none were ever charged. One name stood out: Dr. George Hodel. A wealthy physician with a taste for surrealism, living in a mansion just miles from the crime scene. He was brilliant, arrogant, and, as the investigation revealed, increasingly suspicious. Hodel lived in a mansion that seemed torn from a Gothic novel. The darkened windows, the empty hallways, the eerie paintings that lined the walls. One witness claimed to have heard screams coming from his basement. He had access to surgical tools. He knew how to drain blood. He had the means. The LAPD bugged Hodel's house. What they recorded was cryptic and chilling. "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead." Leslie Dillon, a man with a theory, contacted the LAPD in 1949. He insisted he knew who the killer was. He named a man, Jeff Connors. Dillon's details were disturbingly accurate. Was he obsessed? Or hiding something? Dillon described the crime scene in disturbing detail. He knew about the surgical cuts, the letters, the gasoline-smudged fingerprints. He was detained, questioned, but never arrested. And after his release, internal memos revealed something darker. The LAPD had possibly shut down Dillon's investigation to protect one of their own. There was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner and Hollywood insider. Elizabeth had stayed with him for a while. He gave her a list of studio contacts. But one of her shoes was found on his property. He denied everything. Then there was Walter Bailey, a retired surgeon who lived near the crime scene. His daughter was a friend of Elizabeth's sister. He had no known connection to the case. But the surgical skill required to kill and dismember Elizabeth raised enough eyebrows to keep him under investigation. And let's not forget Jack Anderson Wilson, a convicted felon who claimed to know the killer. He died in a fire before he could be questioned further. Each suspect had a reason, a possibility, a shadow of a motive. But none had proof. And so, the LAPD was left with more theories than answers. Theories swirled. Some believed Elizabeth was stalked. Others thought it was a crime of opportunity. And still, others speculated that Elizabeth may have known her killer and trusted him. Elizabeth Short became more than a victim. She became a ghost story. A legend. But ghosts don't just haunt, they reveal. 70 years later, we still talk about the Black Dahlia. But we rarely talk about Elizabeth. Her death became the center of stories, of movies, books, and documentaries. She was transformed from a real woman, a daughter, a sister, a dreamer, into a symbol of mystery, of darkness. Hollywood, the very place that swallowed her up, repurposed her as a fantasy to sell, to be consumed. Every film, every novel, every whisper in dark corners of true crime circles built the Black Dahlia myth. But behind each retelling, behind each reimagining, was a real girl. A girl who dreamed of stardom but was never allowed to fulfill that dream. They didn't know her, but they shaped her story. And America listened. The media didn't care about the woman behind the headlines. They cared about the story. The spectacle. The sensational details that sold newspapers. Her family never gave up on the truth. They remember the kindness, the ambition, the vulnerability that Elizabeth had. They watched her name become a headline and then a ghost. She became a symbol of everything wrong with the way the media treated women, and the way we treated those we didn't understand. Today, visitors still leave flowers at the site where her body was found. Some light candles. Others write notes. They don't just mourn the violence. They mourn the promise what Elizabeth might have become. The life she never got to live. The truth about Elizabeth Short is still out there. But in remembering her, we resist the myth. And reclaim the woman. Elizabeth's story opened the door for a wider conversation about how we protect women. It forced us to question the narrative that was being told, the biases that shaped it, and the systemic flaws that allowed her story to slip through the cracks. It helped push forward new standards in how we handle such cases. She was silenced in life. But her story gave voice to others. And as we remember her not as a symbol, but as a soul, her portrait remains unfinished. It's ours to complete. With dignity. With truth. We've walked through every known corridor of this case. From the sunlit sidewalks of 1940s Los Angeles, to the darkest alleys of forensic silence. And yet, here we are. Still without an ending. What is it about the Black Dahlia that continues to captivate us? Is it the horror? The injustice? Or is it that deep human need to make sense of the senseless? Some call it morbid curiosity. Others call it obsession. But at the core is something more, empathy, cloaked in mystery. Elizabeth Short has become a mirror reflecting our fears, our failures, and our thirst for truth. Elizabeth Short has become more than a name. She is an enigma we can't let go of. She represents the stories we don't tell, those silenced by time, by fear, by ignorance. We search for answers in cold cases. But sometimes the answers we find only lead to more questions. What was it that made this case so unsolvable? What pieces were missing? Unsolved cases remind us that justice is not inevitable. They force us to question systems that fail, narratives that mislead, and biases that blind. The Black Dahlia case was not only a personal tragedy, it was an institutional one. Elizabeth Short's murder was a failure of the justice system. A failure of the media. A failure of those who should have protected her. And yet, it is a failure we can't seem to shake. It has lived on, long after the police gave up, long after the headlines faded. We look back not for entertainment but for accountability. Because if justice can slip away in broad daylight, it begs the question, how many other stories have we buried alongside hers? For every Elizabeth Short, there are thousands of others, women whose voices were never heard, who disappeared from alleyways, hotel rooms, and headlines. For every woman lost in the shadows, there is a family still waiting. A mother, a sister, a father, a friend. Their stories often untold, never finished. Some stories stay with us not because they are solved, but because they never were. And in that never-ending mystery, there is something we can't escape. We've walked her streets, read her letters, examined her myths, and yet, we've only ever touched the surface of her truth. Because the truth, the real story of Elizabeth Short, remains hidden in the shadows. The Black Dahlia case is more than a murder mystery. It is a mirror held up to society, to how we treat women, trauma, and silence. Elizabeth Short's death is not just a cold case. It is a reflection of something larger. It asks us to question how we view the victims of crime, the narratives we create around them, and how we allow their stories to be shaped by the media, by the justice system, by all of us. Elizabeth Short's death is a reflection of the societal failings that continue to this day. We must ask ourselves, who are we to sensationalize the lives of others, especially those who never had a chance to tell their own stories? Unsolved cases remind us that justice is not inevitable. They force us to question systems that fail, narratives that mislead, and biases that blind. The Black Dahlia case was not only a personal tragedy, it was an institutional one. We speak her name not to sensationalize her death, but to humanize the woman beneath the headlines, to reclaim her story from the mystery and the myth. Elizabeth Short is more than the Black Dahlia. She is more than a file, a nickname, a mystery. She is a call to action for better protection of women, for media responsibility, for ethical storytelling. Her legacy lives on. It is a reminder that justice is not just about solving crimes, it's about remembering the victims. And in that remembering, we take one step closer to creating a world where stories like hers are no longer forgotten.